The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Windsor as Margaret Thompson adjusted her black scarf one final time. She had been standing at the same corner since dawn, clutching a small bouquet of white roses that her grandmother had grown in their back garden. The 67-year-old retired teacher had never imagined she would witness this day, though she had known it would come eventually. Around her, thousands of people lined the streets in complete silence. There were no conversations, no mobile phone chatter, just the occasional rustling of fabric as someone shifted position or the soft sound of footsteps as late arrivals found their spots. The atmosphere was unlike anything Margaret had experienced in her lifetime, even during the war stories her parents had shared with her. Young families stood beside elderly couples, all united in their shared sense of loss and respect. Children who normally would be running and playing stood perfectly still, somehow understanding the gravity of the moment without being told. Their parents held them close, whispering quiet explanations about why everyone was so quiet, why Mummy was crying, and why this day was so important. The preparations had been visible for days. Council workers had cleaned every street lamp, every road sign, and even painted fresh lines on the pavement. Shop owners had closed their businesses voluntarily, hanging simple black ribbons on their doors. The local flower shop had run out of white flowers by Tuesday, as residents prepared their own small tributes. Mrs. Chun, who owned the corner bakery, had arrived at 4 in the morning to secure her place. She remembered the Queen visiting their town 15 years ago, how gracious she had been when she stopped to speak with local business owners. The Queen had asked about her family, her journey to England, and had genuinely listened to the answers. It was a 5-minute conversation that Mrs. Chun had treasured ever since. Behind the barriers that separated the crowd from the road, local police officers stood at attention. Many of them had worked security during previous royal visits, but this felt entirely different. Sergeant Williams, a 30-year veteran of the force, found himself fighting back tears as he watched the community he had served his entire career come together in such a profound way. The silence was not empty or uncomfortable. Instead, it felt full of shared memories, collective grief, and mutual respect. People stood shoulder to shoulder with strangers, yet somehow it felt like standing with family. The divisions of daily life seemed to have disappeared overnight, replaced by something much more fundamental and human. As the minutes ticked by, more people continued to arrive. They came from neighboring towns, having driven for hours to be present for this moment. Some were visitors from other countries who happened to be in England and felt compelled to pay their respects. Others were British citizens living abroad who had flown back specifically for this day. An elderly man named Robert, who had served in the Royal Navy during the 1960s, stood ramrod straight despite his 89 years. His Navy uniform, carefully preserved and still fitting after all these years, bore the medals he had earned in service to the crown. His granddaughter, Emma, stood beside him, holding his arm not for his support, but for her own. She had never seen her grandfather cry before, but today she understood why the tears flowed down his weathered cheeks. The anticipation in the air was palpable, yet no one seemed impatient. This was not a crowd waiting for entertainment or spectacle. These were people who understood they were about to witness history, to be part of something that would be remembered and talked about for generations. Children would tell their own children about this day, about the morning when an entire nation stood still to say goodbye to their queen. Local volunteers moved quietly through the crowd, offering water to elderly visitors and ensuring everyone had what they needed. The community spirit that had always existed in this town seemed magnified, as if the shared purpose of the day had brought out the very best in everyone present. As 10 o'clock approached, the silence somehow deepened. Mobile phones disappeared into pockets. Conversations, already whispered, stopped entirely. Even the birds seemed to sense the solemnity of the moment, their morning songs fading to nothing. The only sounds were the distant hum of traffic being diverted around the procession route, and the soft breathing of hundreds of people united in respectful anticipation. Margaret checked her watch and realized the moment was almost upon them. In just a few minutes, they would see the coffin that carried their queen on her final journey home. She thought about all the time she had seen Queen Elizabeth on television, in newspapers, and during her single visit to their town. The Queen had been a constant presence throughout Margaret's entire life, a symbol of stability and continuity through decades of change. The weight of the moment settled over the crowd like a gentle blanket. This was not just the passing of a monarch, but the end of an era that had defined their lives, their country, and their understanding of service and duty. As they stood in their silent vigil, each person carried their own memories and their own reasons for being there, yet all were connected by their shared respect for a woman who had dedicated her life to serving others. The distant sound of ceremonial drums began to echo through the streets, so faint at first that people wondered if they were imagining it. But as the rhythmic beating grew stronger, a visible ripple of recognition passed through the waiting crowd. After hours of patient waiting, the moment had finally arrived. Police motorcycles appeared first, their riders maintaining perfect formation as they slowly made their way down the street. The officers wore their dress uniforms, and their bikes gleamed in the morning sunlight. Behind them came mounted police, their horses stepping in careful cadence, their hooves creating a gentle clip-clop rhythm that seemed to match the beating hearts of everyone watching. James Morrison, a local photographer who had covered dozens of community events over his 20-year career, found his hands shaking as he adjusted his camera settings. He had photographed weddings, celebrations, and local festivals, but nothing had prepared him for the emotional weight of this moment. Through his viewfinder, he could see the faces in the crowd, each one telling its own story of grief, respect, and love. The military personnel who appeared next moved with the precision that comes from countless hours of practice. Their uniforms were immaculate, their bearing perfect, yet their faces reflected the same deep emotion that filled the watching crowd. These were men and women who had sworn oaths of service to the crown, and today they were fulfilling that duty in the most solemn way possible. Sarah, a nurse at the local hospital, had taken her first day off in 6 months to be present for this moment. She stood with her 2 teenage daughters, who had initially complained about having to wake up so early, but now watched in fascination as history unfolded before them. Sarah remembered watching the Queen's coronation coverage as a child with her own grandmother, never imagining that one day she would witness the final chapter of that same remarkable life. The honor guard appeared next, their movements synchronized to perfection. Each step was measured, each turn executed with military precision. Their rifles were held at exactly the same angle, their heads held high with dignity and pride. These soldiers represented not just the British military, but the deep respect and admiration that the armed forces had held for their commander-in-chief throughout her 70-year reign. Among the crowd, veterans began to straighten their backs and lift their chins. Men and women who had served in conflicts around the world, from the Falklands to Afghanistan, felt the weight of their service in a new way today. They had served under this queen, had taken their oaths in her name, and had carried out their duties knowing that she understood and valued their sacrifice. An elderly woman named Dorothy, who had worked as a seamstress in London during the 1950s, remembered the young queen she had occasionally glimpsed during public appearances. Back then, Elizabeth had been a mother of young children, still learning to balance the demands of monarchy with the desires of motherhood. Dorothy had watched her grow into her role, becoming more confident and assured with each passing year. The sound of the drums grew louder, and now the crowd could hear the measured footsteps of the military bands. The music was not celebratory, but rather deeply moving and respectful. Each note seemed to carry the weight of history, the echo of all the ceremonies, parades, and state occasions that the Queen had attended throughout her remarkable life. Local shop owner Ahmed Hassan had closed his store to be present with his family. He had immigrated to Britain 25 years ago and had always been moved by the Queen's speeches about unity, tolerance, and the strength that comes from diversity. His children, born in Britain, considered themselves fully British, and He wanted them to witness this historic moment as part of their heritage. As the procession drew closer, people began to remove their hats and place their hands over their hearts. The gesture spread through the crowd like a wave, a spontaneous show of respect that required no organization or instruction. Children mimicked their parents, somehow understanding the solemnity of the moment, even if they couldn't fully comprehend its significance. The flags that lined the route hung at half-mast, their fabric moving gently in the morning breeze. Union Jacks mixed with local flags and regimental colors, creating a tapestry of symbols that represented the many different communities and organizations that the Queen had supported and championed throughout her reign. Marcus, a university student studying history, stood with his notebook in hand, trying to capture not just the events, but the feeling of this moment. He had written papers about royal ceremonies and state occasions, but experiencing one firsthand was entirely different from studying them in books. The academic understanding of monarchy and tradition suddenly became deeply personal and emotional. The military band came into view, their instruments catching the light as they played a haunting melody that seemed to speak directly to the hearts of everyone listening. The musicians maintained their formation perfectly, their music providing a soundtrack for this most solemn of occasions. Each note was played with precision and feeling, a final musical tribute to their queen. Behind the band, the honor guard continued their measured march. These were the finest soldiers that Britain could offer, chosen for their excellence and their dedication to duty. Today, they were not just performing a ceremony, but fulfilling what many of them considered the greatest honor of their military careers. The crowd's silence remained absolute, broken only by the occasional sniff or the rustle of tissue paper as tears were quietly wiped away. This was not a time for words or commentary. This was a time for presence, for bearing witness, for showing respect through the simple act of being there and maintaining the dignity that the moment demanded. As the front of the procession reached their section of the route, the full reality of what they were witnessing began to sink in for everyone present. This was not a rehearsal or a practice run. This was the actual moment when their queen was making her final journey through the streets she had served for so many decades. In just a few more minutes, they would see her coffin, and this long chapter of British history would take another step towards conclusion. The gun carriage came into view slowly, drawn by 8 black horses whose hooves struck the pavement with a rhythm that seemed to echo through every heart in the crowd. The ornate carriage, used for state occasions for over a century, carried its most precious cargo on this September morning. Atop it rested the coffin, draped in the royal standard and bearing the imperial state crown, the orb, and the scepter. Margaret Thompson felt her breath catch in her throat as the reality of the moment hit her fully. This was their queen, Elizabeth II, making her final journey through the streets of the realm she had served with such dedication. The white roses in Margaret's hands suddenly felt inadequate, too small a gesture for such an enormous loss, yet somehow perfect in their simplicity. The silence of the crowd deepened even further, if such a thing was possible. Thousands of people stood as motionless as statues, their eyes fixed on the coffin that held the woman who had been a constant in their lives for so many decades. The only sounds were the clip-clop of the horses' hooves, the gentle creaking of the gun carriage, and the soft footsteps of the military escort walking alongside. Young Thomas Chun, standing beside his grandmother, had never experienced silence like this. The 8-year-old was used to noise, activity, and constant movement, but something about this moment made him understand that he needed to be completely still. He watched the horses with fascination, noting how perfectly they moved together, how their handlers guided them with such care and precision. The military personnel walking alongside the gun carriage moved with a precision that came from months of rehearsal, yet their faces showed that this was far from routine. These were soldiers, sailors, and airmen who had served under this queen, who had taken their oaths in her name, and who now had the honor of escorting her on her final journey. Each step was measured, each movement deliberate and respectful. Behind the gun carriage, members of the royal family walked in formation, their faces composed but clearly struggling with their grief. The sight of the new king, walking behind his mother's coffin, brought tears to many eyes in the crowd. This was a son saying goodbye to his mother, even as he prepared to take on the enormous responsibilities that she had carried for 7 decades. Mrs. Patterson, who had taught primary school in the town for 40 years, found herself thinking about all the time she had taught children about the monarchy, about duty and service, about what it meant to dedicate one's life to others. She had used Queen Elizabeth as an example countless times, never imagining that one day she would be standing here, watching that example come to its final conclusion. The horses pulling the gun carriage were magnificent animals, specially trained for ceremonial duties. Their black coats gleamed in the morning sunlight, and their bearing was as dignified as that of the soldiers surrounding them. The handlers who walked beside them were experts in their field, men and women who understood that today they were not just managing horses, but participating in one of the most important moments in British history. As the procession passed directly in front of where she stood, Margaret noticed the flowers that had been placed on the coffin. They were simple and elegant, a personal touch that somehow made the grand ceremony more intimate. These are not just state symbols and royal regalia, but flowers chosen by a family saying goodbye to someone they loved. The crowd's emotion was palpable, yet controlled. People wept quietly, their tears falling silently as they watched their queen pass by one final time. There was no wailing or dramatic gesturing, just the quiet grief of a nation saying farewell to someone who had been a constant presence in their lives. Many had never known a Britain without Queen Elizabeth II, and the reality of that change was sinking in as they watched the procession. Dr. Williams, who had served as the town's doctor for 35 years, stood with his wife and adult children, thinking about all the changes he had witnessed during his career. Throughout all the advances in medicine, all the social changes, all the political upheavals, the Queen had remained a steady presence. Her Christmas broadcast had provided continuity and comfort. Her public appearances had brought joy and excitement to communities across the nation. The precision of the military escort was breathtaking. Every rifle was held at exactly the same angle, every step taken in perfect unison. These were not just soldiers performing a duty, but men and women who understood they were participating in history. Many of them had served in conflicts around the world, but they would later say that escorting their queen on her final journey was the greatest honor of their military careers. Children in the crowd watched with wide eyes, sensing the importance of the moment, even if they couldn't fully understand it. Parents held them close, knowing that this was something they would remember for the rest of their lives. These children would one day tell their own children about the morning they watched Queen Elizabeth II's final journey through their town. The sound of the horses' hooves created a rhythmic backdrop that seemed to match the heartbeat of the nation. Each step brought them closer to the end of this part of the journey, closer to the final farewell that awaited at Windsor Castle. Yet for the people lining the streets, this passing moment felt eternal, something to be treasured and remembered forever. As the gun carriage moved past their section of the route, people began to gently toss their flowers into the street. The white roses that Margaret had brought joined hundreds of other bouquets, creating a carpet of blooms that honored their queen. The flowers were simple gifts from ordinary people, but together they created something beautiful and meaningful. The royal standard fluttered gently in the morning breeze, its bright colors providing a striking contrast to the solemnity of the occasion. This flag had flown over palaces and royal residences for decades, had accompanied the Queen on countless official visits, and now was making its final journey with her through the streets of the realm she had served so faithfully. Behind the immediate family, representatives from across the Commonwealth walked in the procession, showing that this loss was felt far beyond Britain's shores. The Queen had been head of the Commonwealth, a role she had taken seriously throughout her reign, building relationships and strengthening ties between nations across the globe. As the procession continued down the street, moving slowly toward its final destination, The crowd remained in respectful silence. This was their moment to say goodbye, their chance to show their appreciation for 7 decades of selfless service. No words were needed. Their presence was tribute enough, their silence more eloquent than any speech could have been. As the procession moved away from their section of the route, the crowd remained motionless for several minutes longer. No one wanted to break the spell of the moment, to return to ordinary life after witnessing something so profound and historic. The silence that had begun at dawn continued, as if the entire town was holding its breath, processing what they had just experienced. Margaret Thompson stood with tears streaming down her face, clutching the stems where her white roses had been. She had thrown her flowers into the street as the Queen passed, joining the thousands of other tributes that now carpeted the route in a rainbow of colors. The sight of so many individual gestures of love and respect creating something beautiful together seemed to perfectly capture what the Queen had meant to her people. Slowly, very slowly, conversations began to resume in whispered tones. People turned to strangers beside them and shared their feelings, their memories, their sense of witnessing history. The barriers that normally exist between people seemed to have completely dissolved, replaced by a shared understanding of loss and gratitude. "I've never experienced anything like that," whispered Mrs. Chun to the woman standing next to her. The stranger nodded, wiping away her own tears. 70 years, she replied softly. 70 years of service. How do you even begin to say thank you for that? The children in the crowd seemed to understand that something momentous had just occurred, even if they couldn't articulate exactly what it meant. 8-year-old Sophie held her mother's hand tightly and asked, "Will we remember this forever, Mummy?" Her mother squeezed her hand and nodded. "Forever and always, sweetheart. This is something we'll never forget." Local volunteers began moving through the crowd again, but now they were offering tissues and gentle words of comfort rather than water bottles. The emotional weight of the morning had affected everyone present, and the community spirit that had brought people together was now helping them process their shared grief. Robert, the elderly Navy veteran, found himself surrounded by younger people who wanted to thank him for his service and hear his memories of the Queen. His granddaughter Emma watched with pride as her grandfather shared stories of meeting the Queen during his naval career, of the respect she had always shown to servicemen and women, of the way she had made everyone feel valued and appreciated. As the morning progressed, people began to share their own stories about the Queen. Mrs. Patterson told anyone who would listen about the day the Queen had visited their local school in 1987, how she had spoken with the children and teachers, how she had remembered to ask about a student who had been ill during her previous visit to the area years before. The flower shop owner, who had run out of white flowers days before, found herself crying as she looked at the carpet of blooms covering the street. Every flower represented someone's love, someone's gratitude, someone's desire to say goodbye properly. The simple beauty of it was overwhelming, a perfect tribute from ordinary people to an extraordinary woman. Ahmed Hassan gathered his family together as they prepared to return home. His teenage daughter asked him why he had insisted they all come today, why it was so important to close the shop and stand in the cold for hours. He struggled to find the words, then simply said, "Because she welcomed us. When we came to this country, she made it clear that we belonged here too. Today was our chance to say thank you." The photographers and journalists who had covered the event found themselves struggling with their own emotions. James Morrison, who had planned to take pictures throughout the procession, discovered that he had lowered his camera during the most crucial moments, too moved by what he was witnessing to think about documentation. The images that mattered most, he realized, were the ones burned into his memory. Gradually, very gradually, the crowd began to disperse. But no one hurried. People walked slowly, still processing what they had witnessed, still connected to each other by the shared experience. Many stopped to look back at the street where the procession had passed, as if trying to imprint the memory even more deeply. The local pub, which had remained closed during the procession out of respect, quietly opened its doors. People drifted in slowly, not to celebrate, but to continue the conversations that had begun on the street. Strangers sat together, sharing tea and quiet conversation about what they had just witnessed, about what it meant to them personally and to the country as a whole. Dr. Williams found himself thinking about continuity and change as he walked home with his family. The Queen had been such a constant presence that it was difficult to imagine Britain without her. Yet today had also shown him something hopeful about the character of the British people. The respectful silence, the genuine emotion, the way strangers had supported each other through a difficult moment. The university student, Marcus, sat on a bench near the route with his notebook, trying to capture not just the facts of what had happened, but the feeling of it. How do you describe silence, so profound it seemed to have weight? How do you explain the way thousands of individual people became something larger than themselves? How do you document the moment when history becomes personal? Social media, which had been largely silent during the procession itself, began to fill with posts and photographs. But even online, the tone remained respectful and thoughtful. People shared their own pictures from the day, their memories of the Queen, their thoughts about what her reign had meant to them and their families. The local council workers who would later clean up the flowers did so with extraordinary care, treating each bouquet as the precious tribute it was. Many of the flowers would be collected and composted in the palace gardens, returning to the earth that the Queen had loved and cared for throughout her life. As the afternoon wore on, the town gradually returned to normal activity, but something fundamental had changed. People nodded to each other on the street with a new sense of connection. Shopkeepers and customers spoke more kindly to each other. Children played more quietly, somehow still carrying the solemnity of the morning with them. The television coverage would continue for hours, and newspapers would analyze every detail of the procession for days to come. But for the people who had stood on those streets, who had felt the silence and witnessed the respect, no analysis was needed. They had said goodbye to their Queen in the way she would have wanted, with dignity, with love, and together as a community. That evening, as Margaret Thompson sat in her garden looking at the rose bush that had provided her tribute flowers, she felt a sense of completion. She had been present for one of the most important moments in British history. She had paid her respects to a woman who had dedicated her life to service. And she had been part of something larger than herself, part of a nation saying farewell to someone they had loved and respected for 70 years. 3 days after the procession, the town still carried the quiet dignity of that morning in its streets and in the conversations of its people. The flowers that had carpeted the route were gone now, carefully collected and taken to create a memorial garden at the castle, but their fragrance seemed to linger in the air, a sweet reminder of the love that had been poured out that day. Margaret Thompson returned to the corner where she had stood, drawn by a need to revisit the place where she had witnessed history. She wasn't alone. Throughout the day, others came too, standing quietly for a few moments, some leaving new flowers, others simply pausing to remember. The spot had become unofficial holy ground, made sacred by the shared experience of profound respect and genuine grief. The local newspaper, which came out every Thursday, dedicated its entire front page to a single photograph taken during the procession. It showed the silent crowd, their faces reflecting the full spectrum of human emotion, united in their respect for their departed queen. The editor, who had covered community events for 20 years, wrote that in all his experience, he had never witnessed such a perfect example of what it meant to be British. Mrs. Chun reopened her bakery on Wednesday morning and found customers lingering longer than usual, eager to talk about what they had experienced. The conversations weren't just about the spectacle of the ceremony, but about what the Queen had meant to them personally. She heard stories she had never heard before from neighbors she had known for years, stories about immigrating to Britain, about finding acceptance and belonging, about the Queen as a symbol of stability in uncertain times. The children who had witnessed the procession began to understand its significance in the days that followed. In classrooms across the town, teachers found themselves answering questions about monarchy, about duty, about what it means to spend your entire life serving others. 8-year-old Thomas Chin drew picture after picture of the black horses and the gun carriage, each drawing becoming more detailed as his memory processed what he had seen. The local library experienced an unexpected rush of visitors seeking books about the Queen's reign, about British history, about the monarchy. Mrs. Patterson, the retired teacher, found herself volunteering to help organize special reading sessions for children, sharing stories about the Queen's life and explaining the historical significance of what they had all witnessed together. Dr. Williams noticed something remarkable in his practice during the weeks that followed. Patients seemed more thoughtful, more reflective. Elderly patients shared memories of other royal occasions they had attended, of times when the Queen's presence had brought meaning to their lives. Younger patients asked questions about British traditions, about continuity and change, about what comes next for the country they called home. The university student Marcus turned his notes from that morning into a research project that would eventually become his dissertation. But more than that, the experience changed his understanding of history itself. History wasn't just something that happened in the past to be studied in books. It was something he had participated in, something he had felt and witnessed and been part of creating. Social media posts from that day continued to circulate weeks later, not as viral content seeking attention, but as genuine testimonies to a shared experience. People from around the world who had watched the television coverage reached out to those who had been present on the streets, wanting to understand what it had felt like to be there, to be part of that silent tribute. The Royal Navy veteran Robert found himself invited to speak at local schools about his memories of meeting the Queen during his service. His granddaughter Emma accompanied him to these visits, watching with pride as her grandfather shared stories that brought the Queen's humanity to life for children who had only known her as a figure on coins and stamps. The flower shop owner received letters from people across the country who had seen news coverage of the floral tributes lining the procession route. Many included donations to help create a permanent memorial garden in the town, a place where people could continue to leave flowers and reflect on what the Queen's life and service had meant to them. Ahmed Hassan's family found that the experience had deepened their sense of belonging in Britain. His teenage children, who had sometimes felt caught between cultures, now spoke with pride about being British, about being part of a society that could come together in such a meaningful way to honor someone who had represented the best of public service. The local pub, which had become an informal gathering place for reflection and conversation in the days following the procession, decided to create a permanent memorial corner. Photographs from that morning were framed and displayed alongside guest books where visitors could share their memories and thoughts about the Queen and what she had meant to the community. Television documentaries and newspaper articles continued to analyze every aspect of the funeral proceedings. But for those who had been present on the streets, the academic analysis seemed less important than the emotional truth they had experienced. They had been part of something genuine and profound, something that would shape their understanding of community, respect, and shared humanity for the rest of their lives. The silence that had defined that morning became a kind of template for future community gatherings. When the town held its annual remembrance ceremony 2 months later, people naturally fell into the same respectful quiet that had characterized the Queen's procession. Children who had been present that September morning knew instinctively how to behave, understanding that some moments require silence and stillness. Months later, when asked to describe that day, most people struggled to find adequate words. The experience had been too profound, too emotionally complex, too personally meaningful to capture in simple language. But they all remembered the feeling, the sense of being part of something larger than themselves, the way thousands of individual people had become a single, unified expression of respect and love. Margaret Thompson planted new rose bushes in her garden that autumn, white ones that would bloom each year around the anniversary of the Queen's death. She told her neighbors that she wanted to ensure there would always be white roses available for future generations, for moments when simple flowers might be needed to express feelings too deep for words. The gun carriage had continued its journey that day, carrying its precious cargo to the final ceremony at Windsor Castle, but its passage through their town had created something lasting and meaningful. In the months and years that followed, people would return again and again to that September morning, to the memory of standing together in respectful silence, saying farewell to a queen who had served them faithfully for 7 decades. The legacy of that day wasn't just about remembering Queen Elizabeth II, though her memory would be treasured forever. It was also about discovering what a community could become when united by shared values and mutual respect. It was about learning that sometimes the most powerful gestures are the quietest ones, and that true tribute comes not from grand speeches or elaborate ceremonies, but from the simple act of showing up, standing together, and honoring something greater than ourselves with the gift of our respectful silence.